Hello, it's now at the start of February 2025 and I wanted to do a quick review of the ARC, my preparation, how the race went and my recovery afterwards, and also any lessons learned, any positives and negatives from the event. So what the ARC of attrition is, it's now under the banner of UTMB World Series, but in essence it's a 100-mile foot race, including quite a lot of night running, a hell of a lot of ascent. I think that the organisers underestimated the amount of ascent, according to my Garmin anyway, and it's quite a popular race down in Cornwall. It gets a little bit of press wider in the trail running community, and this year it's attracted several really fast runners. I mean, I was looking to basically just finish, and the spoiler alert is that I got timed out at 80 miles. Anyway, back to the prep for this. As with other trail ultras that I've done in the past, I did a good mix of trail running, fell running, short, medium distance fell races in the lead up to this. I did a series of long runs over the last few months that involved 20-mile epics, including quite a lot of ascent over the mountains up behind us in Wales. And to support this, because after all you need to be fit to run rather than run to be fit, I supported everything with doing a short bank of core exercises, 10 minutes a day, Monday to Friday. I'd also do weights a couple of times a week. I would do the odd class to increase my resistance and cardio work. I'd also attend club sessions with Phil to Cambran, and they were hills and speed sessions. I didn't used to do the Thursday night sessions because I was getting plenty of long runs myself, and they needed to be trail specific. So I honed in on quite a lot of trail specific longer hill reps on the Thursdays, which seemed to work in terms of prep. I had a gradual uplift over the last few months. To be fair, coming out of having done a previous 100-mile attempt in September, I did have a bit of a rest after that, but after that I got back into the long runs, ramped up again, and got up to a pretty good level of ascent and distance under my belt. The type of prep I also did included quite a lot of night running too, which is a lot easier during winter because the arc starts at lunchtime, goes through the night all the way through to the next day, and given that daylight's between, let's think, I started in daylight at 12:30. It was starting to get dark, 4:30, 5 o'clock, and the darkness held out until about, was it about 7:30? It might have been 8 o'clock, I can't quite remember. So quite a lot of the run was going to be in dark anyway, so I had to prepare myself by doing runs at different times of the day and night. When it was dark, I'd maybe do it on a Friday evening, or I'd get up mega early and do a 3-4 a.m. run for like 4 or 5 hours first thing on a Saturday morning. So I did do quite a lot of running at different times of the day to mimic the fact that I'd be running basically throughout the day. I did keep up my park running, and that was usually in the form of a park run sandwich, in that I'd do a mountain run, say 3 or 4 hours beforehand, pop down to park run for a slight speed element, and then I'd jog home, for instance. And so that's how I managed to shoehorn in the park runs. In terms of prep, I had a couple of niggles, as I say, which I had to use the physio app for um, to include some strength exercises. I had a slight niggle on my left outside knee and also my hamstring, and with the physio exercises that I had meant that actually my body was in much better shape than it's ever been before a race in my life. I did do a 3-week taper off beforehand. Everybody does a completely different taper. I did a slightly shorter taper before my last 100-mile attempt, and in this version I wanted to cut back a lot more in the final week, in as much as I didn't actually run for was it 4 or 5? Yeah, it was probably 5 days before the race, and that meant that I was a lot more rested. I mean, I was slightly restless by the end of this, but I feel that it mentally and physically gave me the potential to be able to complete the race, because the worst thing you could do is rock up at a start line absolutely knackered and you've not tapered off correctly, because you're not giving your body the best chance to actually perform. Whereas you'll probably get away with quite a short, sharp taper before a half marathon, or perhaps 3 weeks before a marathon. Before an ultra marathon, you really do need to cut off quite sharply about a week or so beforehand, to ensure that you just catch up on your sleep and your rest. Because at the end of the day, you'll be cutting into your sleep banks when you're running overnight. So you need to also ensure that your sleep's quite good in the few days beforehand. So this is a story about what worked and didn't work for me. As with everything in life, you need to think about your own situation and make decisions about your own training. And so my reflections are that there were some positives and negatives throughout the race. Some I could have potentially have planned, but some things were just out of my control, totally out of my control. And I'll now tell you about the race. So the race started in my mind in the fact that you congregate at the finish and then you're taken by coach to the start. It takes about an hour to go through the windy Cornwall lanes to there. It was perishingly cold that morning, and we were basically sat under a shelter for about an hour and a half. It was absolutely freezing before we jumped onto that coach, so thank goodness we got onto the coach for an hour into the warmth. We then had about 3/4 of an hour before the start, which again was pretty cold. And you've got to bear in mind that whilst we have essential kit, we don't have dry robes, we don't have very thick puffer jackets. At that point in time, I had a synthetic down mid-layer gillet, and I had my long sleeve top and my long sleeve bottoms and what have you, and my hat and my gloves and what have you from my backpack. But it might have been nice to have had something thermal that I could have chucked away. I did have a bin bag over me, but it wasn't particularly windy, so I didn't overly need it. But it would have been nice to have had something a bit more thermal to have thrown away before the start. So on to the race. Let's think. So it started, as I say, it started at a place called Coverack, which is on the east coast towards the tip of Cornwall. And at the start, you have this almost theatre going on, in that in the lead down to the race you have motivating music. You have the hand claps in the air and all that, da, 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 and then you're off. And then you're running down the hill, round the first corner, and then up a very sharp incline, past some twee cottages, and then you're queuing up to get through a kissing gate. So there was a bit of queuing up here and there for the first couple of miles, which made it a bit tricky to be able to get into any flow. But then I was on my way. We went through the early stages at Lizard Point. It was still daylight by then, so trucking fairly well, some uneven ground, some ups and downs, some technical aspects. And then we went into daylight. No, sorry, we went into darkness, I should say. And then on it went until I hooked into Porthleven for the first aid station, which had the first food. It was really congested in the aid station. There were people, there were crew, there were volunteers. Quite a nice vibe and atmosphere. The food was okay, so I scooped up. I had a few bits and pieces, but I just didn't stay too long before I was off on the trail again, back out into the dark and cold. And then there were a few ups and downs and what have you, and then you hit quite a flat urban type section. So I think it must be at least 10 miles, which were trogging along almost a cycle path and then a road, with a few sand dunes chucked in here and there, between a place called Marazion, through Penzance, through the next aid station, scoop up a bit more food, and then out to Mosul, which is a tiny little fishing village, very twee again. And then that ended the flattish section. To be fair, I found the first part of the race, the first third, a bit samey, because you were hugging the coast all the time, and all of the coves pretty much looked all the same. Sorry, Cornwall, very pretty and all, but I was almost grateful for the darkness, because it meant that you had the head torch in front of you and you could just focus on your running without it all seeming a bit samey. I found this before when I ran down the canal between Brecon and Newport once, and it was very samey, because all you're seeing is the same things all the time, the same hedges, the same canal and what have you. So I had a similar feeling to that going around Cornwall. Yeah, and then it got a bit samey on the cycle path for the 10 miles. But at this stage I was drinking okay, came out of Penzance fine, out through Mosul, and then the lumpy bumpiness started, and it was really late at night at this stage. I think it was possibly coming up to 11 midnight when I came out of Penzance. And this is where the fun started, because the course was relatively dry. I mean, when I say relatively dry, sure, there was some mud underfoot because, of course, there'd been hundreds of runners in front of me. But we just had these two freak storms that were very windy, icy cold rain. I mean, I don't know if it was sleet, but it felt icy cold, and so you basically had to make a decision. Do I carry on or do I lose time putting on my waterproof? So I lost time putting on my waterproof. My headphones blew off and busted, but at least I had a windproof on me, and I also put my waterproof leggings on as well at that stage. As a result, from going relatively dry underfoot to a short shower meant that the rocks became quite slippery, and it was almost like as though they were like a skating rink. Somebody described it as being on a skating rink. So I found it a bit tricky going down the sharp descents, the gullies. So there are a couple of these freak showers, but then they kind of cleared up. But unfortunately, what it left in its wake was very damp underfoot, very skiddy, very slidey. The poles came out into use, and I'm so glad I had my poles to use. And so things started to slow down slightly. I got through Porthcurno. I was spitting feathers at the organisers. I was calling them all sorts of expletives. And then I trotted through to Land's End, which you saw the bright lights of the hotel coming up in the distance. And the running was okay around about Land's End for a little bit. A colleague from my running club, his wife was there at the aid station, so we had a bit of a chat there. And I also patched up my toes, because basically where it was so wet, all of the K-tape that I put around my poor little toes had fallen off, and so my toes had started to get slightly sore, so I had to stop, dry off my toes, and then put as much K-tape as possible I can in the time available to me. That added some time, at which upon reflection, could I have gone on without reapplying the K-tape and spending 10-15 minutes? Possibly, but my feet would have been ripped to shreds because they had no protection between the toes and my sock and shoe. But I did take that decision to reapply the K-tape, to apply some protection to the skin of my toes, and there were 2 middle toes on each side, and basically those got wrecked. But fortunately, the small toes, the big toes, the back base of the foot were absolutely fine because I used the K-tape sensibly. So onwards out of Land's End, and this is when things started to slow down slightly. Things started to get very, I don't know if the word is vertical, but the ascents became quite sharp and steep, and there were almost flights of steps these steps were at least a foot high, if not sometimes a foot and a half, 2 foot high. So it was a real cardiac affair. I found it really, really strenuous. And at that stage of the race, I was languishing slightly. I got into Bottleack with 15 minutes to spare below the cut-off, so I had a quick turnaround, and as a consequence of not having much time at the aid station, I didn't have the time to take off my waterproofs, so I was running with my waterproofs and I felt too warm, so I had to stop and take my waterproofs off, blah 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 blah. And because you don't have enough time at the aid station to do your personal admin, you end up doing it on the trail, which then has a knock-on because you're spending time not running instead of running. And so I think that that's where things fell down, is my personal admin. And also you could say due to the weather, then my feet got really wet, so I had to spend more time patching it up. Anyway, moving on. We then went from Bottleack through to the St Ives section, and that is quite an arduous one. It's about 15-16 miles, and it took me roughly about 6 hours, which is an insane amount of time. But at that stage, the paths were extremely parlous, I would say. They were very slippery. You'd had hundreds of people going up and down them. The National Trust must have been spitting feathers after us lots going over the trails. But anyway, so So there were again some vertical ascents with some flights of steps, scrambling over sections of rock. I mean, I'm looking at the map here now. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 ascents in 16 miles, and yeah, you could feel it in your legs. And so in this section there were parts which again had those vertical flights up them. When I say vertical, there is a slight ascent. We're not talking a ladder, we're talking like this, but it's almost as though you're just trogging up flights of steps. And in between the flights of steps, when you're finishing with that, there were great areas of bog that had stepping stones across it. Unfortunately, the stepping stones would be stepped on by at least 300-400 other people at that point. So again, there was a lot of mud and slipperiness on the stepping stones, so you have to be careful of the stepping stones. All this slowed you down. And I did try to run between all of the sections that I couldn't run in, because the advice at the last aid station was run when you can, and I ran when I can. And I came into St Ives still running, running where I could, but unfortunately I was timed out. The cut-off time was 2:30 and I got in at 2:55. So time was up. I had plenty more running left in me, and I'm sure that if I had my time again, would I have done it differently? Perhaps I would have spent less time at Land's End, but then my toes would have got more ripped to shreds. If I hadn't have applied the K-tapers diligently, perhaps I could have sped up in the sections where I could have run more, between Bottleack and St Ives, potentially. But then by that stage I had been running 24 hours overnight, so I was pretty tired. By that stage. Still, I got to St Ives and I had this, and I had some really nice food at the aid station. I'm not vegan, but they had this fantastic vegan thin crust pizza with fake pepperoni on and stuff. And I think it was tomato in the crust as well. It was absolutely amazing. I mean, I just stood there eating 3 slices, just wolfed it down. And then they offered me sponge with custard, and I think it was a Swiss roll with a little blob of custard on it. I mean, it just tasted amazing at that stage. I kindly got a lift back with somebody from my running club, who took me back to the finish to get my car, and then I took that back to my accommodation. So would I do it again? Would I do the arc again? I don't think I will, because it was quite a chunk of annual leave that I had. Because the race starts on the Friday, you need to register on the Thursday, so that's 2 days of annual leave. Then you need a couple of days to recover afterwards, so that's 4 days annual leave in all. So it's quite holiday hungry in terms of time off from work. And whilst the challenge was fantastic, the organisation was fantastic, I think it's only fair to myself to not do it again, because if I was finding it samey in the first third, then if the daylight section's going to be more coastline, I think that the coastline's slightly wasted on me. I perform better with more woods, forests, mountains around me. What I would say is that some positives that came out of this are that I became more used to trying to negotiate rocky, stony, scrambly ground during an extended long run. I also became a little bit more confident running along cliff edge passes, because you bear in mind that we had Storm Yoan happening at the time, which meant that you had waves crashing down at the bottom of the cliffs below, and you'd be kind of hugging to the side of the rocks as you were going along the cliff top passes, and it was yeah, it was slightly hair raising. So whilst I'm proud of what I did, yes, there was possibly some learning around personal admin, and I'm going to have to think of further strategies with respect to my feet, because clearly K-tape in very wet conditions doesn't really kick it. So moving on, my next challenge will be another attempt of the Cotswold Way Century 100. Well, 102. I got 92 miles in the last time before I bailed out. So I'm hoping, given the experience that I've had this time in the Arc is way harder than that race. And if I still had some running left in me at 80 miles at this race, then I feel quite confident going into that race come September. In the meantime, I'm going to have a shorter, faster training block, in the sense that I'm going to try and do shorter, faster events, shorter, faster fell races, and do a lot more speed work so that I can get my base speed levels up. I'm going to knock back the longer runs for a little bit just to give my body a break from doing that, because you can't go on forever doing 20-mile runs each weekend. So I'm going to have a few months off of the longer distance weekend runs, and then I'll ramp it up again before September. So that's the Arc. I would highly recommend that people do it once in their lifetime. I've got friends who've done it several times. I can see how it gets slightly addictive and that you want to finish it, because it's an absolutely fantastic race. Absolutely, hands down, brilliant organisation, great support from the volunteers. You have such challenging conditions both underfoot and with the added aspect of the climbing up the steps, the scrambling over the rocks and what have you. For instance, down in one cove you had a 200-metre section and you were hopping over what I can only describe as dinosaur egg-sized rocks, which at 2 a.m. in the morning is all very quite surreal. So there's some really curious aspects to this event. So if you are partial to thinking about doing the Arc, do it. Do it once in your life. I'm not sure I'll be back again because there's other fish to fry. But if you decide to do it, good luck to you. Anyway, that's all from me now.